The old queen had been dead for 3 years, and everyone thought her secrets had died with her. Then the vault opened. Inside was a single envelope, sealed in red wax, addressed to no one but her grandson. And the moment he read it, the entire royal family realized nothing about their history had ever been what it seemed. For 3 years, the kingdom of Aldemar had mourned Queen Isolde in the way monarchies always mourn, with black armbands, muted trumpets, and a silence so rehearsed it felt like theater. The people wept because they were told to weep. The nobles bowed because bowing was expected. But behind the high windows of Calderwood Palace, no one truly grieved the way her grandson did. Prince Cassian had loved his grandmother the way a boy loves the only adult who never lied to him. And in a family built entirely on careful lies, that made her irreplaceable. Cassian was 29 when the old queen passed, already groomed since childhood to inherit a crown he never asked for. He remembered her hands more than her face. Thin, ink-stained fingers that used to trace the edges of old letters at her writing desk. Fingers that seemed to be holding something back even when she smiled at him. He didn't understand it then. He understood it now. Because 3 years after her funeral, on a gray Tuesday morning that began like any other, a courier arrived at the palace with a single sealed folder marked with the royal wax stamp. Not the current stamp used by the reigning court, but an older one, retired the day Isolde died. Nobody had used that stamp in 3 years. Nobody was supposed to be able to use it at all. The folder had one instruction typed across its front, to be delivered to Prince Cassian upon the 3rd anniversary of Queen Isolde's death, and to no one else, under any circumstance, for any reason. The private secretary who received it did not open it. He knew better. He had served 2 monarchs and buried enough palace secrets to understand that some envelopes were not meant to be intercepted, not even out of loyalty. He carried it directly to Cassian's private study, past the offices of Duchess Renata's staff, past the portraits of kings who had learned the same lesson the hard way, that in this family, the truth always arrived late and always arrived expensive. Cassian was reviewing trade documents when the folder was placed in front of him. He recognized the seal instantly. His hands went still. He had spent 3 years assuming his grandmother had told him everything before she died. She had spoken to him for hours in her final weeks, about duty, about mercy, about the weight of a crown that could crush a man who wore it carelessly. She had never once mentioned a hidden decree. She had never once mentioned a vault. Inside was not a letter explaining anything simple. It was a legal decree, drafted in the Queen's own formal hand, dated 4 years before her death, a full year before her final illness began. It was witnessed by 2 names Cassian did not recognize, both long since retired from royal service, both sworn, according to a footnote, to absolute secrecy until this exact date arrived. The decree stated in the dry procedural language of royal law that access to a specific chamber beneath the eastern wing of Calderwood Palace, a vault built during the reign of Isolde's own grandmother, used for generations to store personal family effects too sensitive for public archives, was to be restricted permanently from one person and one person only. Cassian read the name 3 times before it settled. Renata was not simply a step-grandmother by circumstance. She had married Cassian's grandfather, King Aldric, 11 years after the death of Cassian's own mother, Princess Seraphine, the woman the tabloids of that era had called the People's Princess, the commoner who had married into the crown and been quietly, systematically dismantled by it. Seraphine had died when Cassian was 6 years old, in circumstances the palace had always described as a tragic accident during a diplomatic visit abroad. Cassian had grown up believing that story completely, the way children believe anything repeated often enough by adults they trust. But he had also grown up watching how carefully his mother's name was avoided in official settings, how her portrait had been moved from the main gallery to a smaller hallway near the servants' stairs within 2 years of her death, how Renata, upon marrying into the family, had quietly requested and received several of Seraphine's personal jewels for her own use, jewels that had technically belonged to the crown collection rather than to Seraphine herself, but which everyone in the palace understood had been chosen for their sentimental weight, not their monetary one. Cassian had never asked questions about it as a boy. Princes are trained not to ask questions that embarrass the family. But standing now in his study with his grandmother's decree in his hands, he understood for the first time that Isolde had noticed everything he had once been too young to name, and she had done something about it, quietly, legally, permanently, the way she did everything. The decree explained that the Eastern Vault contained materials Isolde herself had collected and sealed personally, correspondence, medical records, financial statements, and sworn testimonies related to the final 2 years of Princess Seraphine's life. It stated plainly that these materials revealed information about the circumstances surrounding Seraphine's death that the family never made public, information Isolde had chosen for reasons she explained in a second sealed letter within the same vault, not to release while she was alive. She had not wanted a war within the family while she still had the strength to prevent one, but she had also refused to let the truth disappear with her. The decree ended with a single directive. Only Prince Cassian, upon reaching the 3rd anniversary of her death, and only after demonstrating, in the Queen's own words, the steadiness of character required not to burn the whole house down upon learning what is inside, would be. Cassian sat in silence for nearly an hour after finishing the document. He thought about calling his father, King Aldric, who had remarried Renata, and who Cassian suspected knew far less about his second wife's history than he believed. He thought about calling his younger sister, Princess Odalis, who had always been closer to Renata than he had. In the end, he called no one. He picked up the folder, walked to his private safe, retrieved the small brass key his grandmother had given him on his 25th birthday with instructions to keep it somewhere Renata will never think to look, and for the first time in 4 years, understood exactly what that key was for. The Eastern Vault had not been opened by anyone outside of Isolde's closest circle in over a decade. It sat behind 3 separate doors, one wooden, ceremonial, rarely locked, one iron, original to the building's construction 2 centuries earlier, and one modern steel door installed quietly during renovations that the public had been told were structural repairs. Only the final door required the brass key. Cassian's hand trembled as he turned it. Inside, the room was smaller than he expected. No gold, no jewels, nothing resembling the treasure vaults of childhood imagination. Just shelving, filing boxes, and a single wooden writing desk that Cassian recognized immediately as his grandmother's. On top of the desk sat a stack of folders neatly labeled in her handwriting, and beside them a second sealed envelope with his name written across the front in ink that had visibly faded with age. His grandmother's letter was longer than the decree and far less formal. She wrote as though she were speaking to him directly, the way she used to during their long afternoon walks through the palace gardens when he was a boy. She told him she was sorry. Sorry that she had not protected his mother while there was still time. Sorry that palace politics had cost her the courage to speak up when speaking up might have mattered. She wrote that Seraphine had never been the fragile, accident-prone woman the official record described. She wrote that, in the 2 years before her death, Seraphine had repeatedly raised concerns to the Queen privately about being isolated from decision-making, about being excluded from medical consultations regarding her own health, about financial decisions being made in her name without her knowledge. Isolde admitted that at the time she had dismissed some of these complaints as the ordinary friction of a commoner adjusting to royal life. She admitted, in the plainest language Cassian had ever seen her use, that she had been wrong. The folders on the desk contained the evidence Isolde had spent years quietly gathering after Seraphine's death. Not to punish anyone publicly, she wrote, but to ensure that if her grandson ever needed the truth to protect himself or his mother's memory, it would exist somewhere beyond the reach of anyone who wanted it erased. Before he read another page, Cassian allowed himself a moment to simply sit with the room itself. He noticed how carefully everything had been arranged, how his grandmother had labeled each folder not with dates alone, but with small, handwritten notes on the tabs, as if she had known that whoever eventually opened them would need guidance to make sense of a story assembled in fragments over years. He noticed a faint smell of old paper and cedar, the same smell that used to cling to her private study when he was a child, sneaking in to read while she worked. For a moment, he wasn't a prince standing in a hidden vault uncovering a decades-old injustice. He was simply a boy who missed his grandmother and who understood, perhaps for the first time, that missing her and learning the truth about her were not separate experiences at all. Cassian spent the rest of that day inside the vault, reading documents that rewrote his entire childhood in the space of a few hours. Medical consultation records showed that Seraphine had raised concerns about her own treatment months before her death, concerns that had been redirected and minimized by staff who answered not to her, but to the senior royal household. Staff who, notes indicated, had been placed in those positions at Renata's recommendation years before Renata had officially become anything more than a family friend visiting the palace with increasing frequency. There were letters between Seraphine and a close friend, a woman named Talia, who had served as her lady-in-waiting and who Cassian remembered vaguely from childhood, before she had abruptly left royal service without explanation. In one letter, Seraphine wrote that she felt watched, not cared for, and that she suspected someone close to the family was positioning themselves for a future that assumed she would not be part of it. She never named anyone directly. She didn't have to. The pattern of names surrounding her in those final years narrowed folder after folder toward one woman who would go on to marry King Aldric less than a year after an appropriate mourning period had technically concluded. Cassian found himself lingering longest over the letters from Talia. He remembered her only as a warm voice that used to hum lullabies through his nursery door, a woman who vanished from his life so suddenly that, as a child, he had simply accepted her absence the way children accept most adult disappearances, without asking why. Reading her words now, he understood that her departure had not been a resignation at all, but something closer to a removal. One letter, dated only weeks before Seraphine's death, described a conversation in which Talia had been quietly warned by a senior member of the household staff that her position was no longer aligned with the direction of the family, language so carefully bureaucratic that it revealed exactly how deliberate the whole campaign had been. Talia had written to Seraphine afterward, apologizing for leaving her alone at the moment she needed an ally most, promising to stay in touch, promising she would never stop believing her. Isolde's own notes, clipped to the back of that letter, confirmed that she had eventually tracked Talia down years later, taken her sworn statement, and preserved it exactly as spoken, unedited, undiminished by time. There was no smoking gun proving foul play. Isolde's letter was careful to say so herself. She had searched for years and found nothing that would hold up as proof of anything criminal. What she found instead was a pattern of exclusion, manipulation, and quiet cruelty dressed up as concern, the kind of pattern that never appears in a single document but becomes undeniable across dozens of them. She had found enough to know that her son's second wife had, at minimum, actively worked to marginalize Seraphine long before her, that he move her portrait back to the main gallery, that he ensure the jewels taken from her collection under sentimental pretense be returned to the Crown collection properly, documented and accounted for, not quietly kept by someone with no rightful claim to them, that he tell the truth to his sister, gently in his own time, so she would understand why Arath trading for their family had always felt slightly hollow at its center, and that he never let anyone, not Renata, not his father, not the palace communications office, convince him that silence was kindness. Isolde wrote that she had believed that lie for far too long, and it had cost her the chance to protect her son's first wife while there was still time to do it. Cassian left the vault that night, carrying 2 boxes of documents, and a weight in his chest that felt entirely different from grief. It felt like clarity. He did not confront Renata immediately. He spent the following week reading every document twice, cross-referencing dates, confirming names, understanding fully before acting at all, the exact steadiness his grandmother had demanded of him before granting access in the first place. He met privately with the palace's chief legal counsel, a man who had served 3 monarchs and who, upon reviewing the decree, confirmed its full legal weight. The vault's contents were real. The restriction on Renata's access was airtight. Isolde had built her final act of protection like a woman who understood that emotion fades but paperwork endures. When Cassian finally requested a private audience with Renata, he did not do it in anger. He met her in the same study where the envelope had first arrived, with the decree and 2 supporting folders placed neatly on the table between them. He told her plainly what he had found, watching her face carefully as he spoke. Not for satisfaction, but because he needed, for his own sake, to know whether anything resembling remorse still lived somewhere behind her composure. Renata did not deny the broad outline of what he described. She reframed it instead, the way people who have spent decades managing perception always do. She spoke of Seraphine as fragile, difficult, prone to exaggeration. She spoke of her own marriage to Aldrich as something that happened naturally, long after Seraphine's death, unrelated to anything that came before. She reminded Cassian, with the practiced calm of someone who had survived worse conversations, that none of this had ever been proven in a court of law, and that raising it now would only embarrass the family and destabilize a monarchy already strained by years of public scrutiny. Cassian listened to all of it. Then he told her, quietly, that he had not called this meeting to put her on trial. He had called it to inform her, as a matter of courtesy she had never extended to his mother, that the Eastern Vault would remain permanently sealed to her by his grandmother's decree, that the jewels taken from the Crown collection under his mother's name would be returned within 30 days, and that Seraphine's portrait would be moved back to the main gallery by the end of the month. He was not asking for her agreement. He was informing her of decisions already made by a woman who was no longer alive to make them herself, decisions he now intended to honor completely. Renata left the room without another word. She did not contest the jewel restitution publicly, likely understanding that any legal challenge would only invite the exact scrutiny she had spent years avoiding. Within 3 weeks, the pieces were quietly returned to the Crown Collection's official inventory, logged and documented by staff instructed to keep the matter entirely out of press releases. Cassian did not want headlines. He wanted correction, not spectacle. The portrait of Princess Seraphine returned to the main gallery on a quiet Thursday morning, rehung in the exact space it had occupied before her death, beside portraits of queens and princesses who had shaped the kingdom's history in ways the public rarely learned about until decades later. Palace staff, who had served long enough to remember the original placement, said nothing, though several were seen pausing in front of it the first week, studying a face many of them had genuinely loved and had watched disappear from the walls without ever being told why. Cassian told his sister everything, exactly as his grandmother had asked, sitting with her for an entire evening in the palace's private library while she read through selected portions of the documents herself. Odalis had been only 3 when their mother died, and had grown up with even less memory of her than Cassian had. She did not react with the anger he expected. She cried quietly for a woman she barely remembered, but had somehow always sensed the family was hiding something about. She thanked him for telling her. She asked to see the portrait the next morning, and stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. There were smaller moments too, the kind that never make it into official records, but somehow mattered just as much. A groundskeeper who had worked at the palace for over 30 years quietly told Cassian, weeks after the portrait was rehung, that he used to leave fresh flowers beneath it every spring when it hung in the main gallery years earlier. A simp lie, because he had liked Seraphine and never understood why she had been treated as something to be tucked away. He had kept doing it in the smaller hallway, foam-all private ritual he continued even after it was moved to the servants' corridor, over a decade, without anyone ever asking him to stop, without anyone ever noticing. Cassian thanked him, quietly, and told him the flowers were welcome to return to their original spot, where more people might finally see them. King Aldrich was the hardest conversation. Cassian approached him last, uncertain whether his father had ever fully known what his grandmother had discovered, or whether he had simply chosen, for years, not to look too closely at his second marriage's foundations. Aldrich's reaction was neither denial nor confession. It was something quieter and sadder, the reaction of a man confronting the possibility that his own comfort had been built, in part, on his first wife's erasure. He did not defend Renata. He did not ask Cassian to reconsider the decree. He asked only for time, and Cassian gave it too, understanding that some truths take longer to sit with than others, even for Kazingim.